This is how the chilling death of Franklin D. Roosevelt unfolded. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, always ranks in the top 3 in surveys of the most influential Americans in history, alongside George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. His decision to enter World War II resulted in the deaths of between 405,399 and 418,500 American citizens. Many families were left without their sons. Like Joseph Kennedy, the father of the future President JFK, who lost his son and eldest child, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., in that war, he never forgave Franklin Roosevelt for it. During his 1940 re-election campaign, Franklin D. Roosevelt promised to keep the United States out of the war in Europe. It was a lie. Roosevelt led the United States to victory in World War II and ushered in the global dominance that continues to this day. He also governed from a wheelchair, a symbol of resilience, after polio cruelly struck him at age 39. He remains the only president to have governed the country for 3 and then 4 terms. A record he will hold indefinitely unless a very difficult constitutional amendment extends the possibility of terms beyond 2. Why did the man who promised millions of mothers that their sons would not go to war send them exactly their 13 months later? How did the most powerful leader in the world govern the United States for 13 years without anyone knowing he was dying? Why was the President of the United States with his lover when he died and not with his wife? How did a man physically destroyed by polio at age 39 end up winning 4 presidential elections from a wheelchair? How is the same man who ordered the internment of 120,000 innocent citizens in camps now ranked in the top 3 most admired presidents in history? What was his death like? Today we will learn everything about the most important American president since the end of the Civil War. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our updates. Polio left him paralyzed at 39 and transformed him into a completely different man. In the summer of 1921, Roosevelt was on vacation enjoying a day of sailing on his yacht when he fell overboard into the cold waters of the Bay of Fundy in Canada. The next day, his legs could no longer support his body. He had been attacked by the polio virus, known at the time as the insidious and deadly enemy. He was 39 years old. Before the invention of the vaccine, most children became immune by age 4. With his life ruined by a disease rare in middle age and already paraplegic, he did not collapse and decided to continue his political career. One of his concerns was how people would react to a disabled politician, but he maintained the mental strength for his return to fame, now as a different man. The national shame, locking up 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps. On February 19, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order No. 9066, granting the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, and his commanders the authority to send to internment camps all persons who could be excluded. Although the measure did not name any particular group, it was designed against the Japanese, many of them American citizens for generations. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast were interned in camps under precarious conditions, surrounded by barbed wire and always under a cloud of suspicion, hostility, and threat. Born into American royalty, the millionaire boy whom a president once wished would never reach the White House. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York, on January 30th, 1882, as the son of members of 2 wealthy families, the businessman James Roosevelt and his second wife, Sarah Delano. His mother, a dominant woman, shaped FDR's childhood and once said, "My son Franklin is a Delano, not a Roosevelt at all." In fact, Roosevelt placed his mother's surname before his own in his name. Although the United States has never been a formal monarchy or aristocracy, these powerful families acted as nobility and royal court. FDR's father, an important Democrat, once took his son to meet President Grover Cleveland, who told the boy, "My little man, I have a strange wish for you. It is that you may never be president of the United States." The elite school that taught him the rich have a duty to serve the people. The Reverend Endicott Peabody, co-founder and headmaster of the Groton School for Boys in Groton, 64 kilometers from Boston, Massachusetts, emphasized manly Christian character when he had Roosevelt among his students from 1896 to 1900. At Groton, Roosevelt joined a group to protect poor children and provided help to a local low-income African-American woman, bringing her food and fuel. Later, FDR acknowledged that Peabody had been more influential in his life than his father or mother. Editor at Harvard, dropout at Columbia, the mediocre student who would conquer the world. Roosevelt attended Harvard University, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1904 and took several courses. He did not stand out as a student or athlete, but he became chief editor of the Harvard Crimson newspaper, a demanding role requiring leadership and dedication. Later, he said about his time at Harvard, "I took economics courses at the university for 4 years, and everything they taught me was wrong." He then entered Columbia Law School and passed the requirements to graduate and practice law, but dropped out before obtaining the degree. He married his cousin, and his controlling mother never left them alone. On March 17th, 1905, a 23-year-old FDR married his cousin Anna Eleanor, also a Roosevelt by birth. Although someone of 23 was already considered a full-grown man at the beginning of the 20th century, Roosevelt's possessive mother, Sarah Delano, greatly disliked her son's marriage because of the independence he would gain by starting a family. The newlyweds moved into a house bought for them by Sarah, who took advantage of the situation to constantly interfere in her son's married life, causing Eleanor much displeasure. Senator at 28, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and a defeat that made him famous. Roosevelt was rich, tall, handsome, and an excellent speaker, an unbeatable package to become a young political star. At 28, he was already a senator, and in 1913 he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Between 1913 and 1917, FDR worked to strengthen the Navy, becoming a staunch advocate of the submarine. The United States entered World War I in the spring of 1917. Roosevelt traveled to France and England in 1918. In the United Kingdom, he met Winston Churchill, his crucial ally during World War II. In 1920, FDR was the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate on the ticket with James M. Cox for president, but they were overwhelmingly defeated by the Republicans led by Warren G. Harding, a bitter defeat for Roosevelt. The affair with Lucy Mercer, the love letters that destroyed his marriage forever. In 1914, Eleanor Roosevelt hired Lucy Page Mercer as her social secretary to help with the social and public relations activities she had to perform as the wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Mercer had a solid education, but her respected Catholic family had fallen on hard times, and she needed to work. FDR began an affair with Lucy Mercer, discovered by Eleanor in 1918 through the lovers' letters. The possibility of divorce loomed, but family, social, and economic considerations prevented it. However, from that moment on, the marriage, with 6 children, no longer had emotional affinity and became a partnership, as some historians have defined it. Governor of New York, they called him a traitor to his class for defending the poor. In 1924, already suffering from polio, FDR attended the Democratic Convention and gave a speech. He was living partially retired, but without neglecting his political contacts. In 1928, he felt strong enough to run for governor of New York State, but doubted the wisdom of running, fearing a crushing defeat due to his physical condition. His party colleagues convinced him that he was their only winning card, and he ran, winning by a narrow margin of just 1%. In 1929, the Great Depression broke out, and during his state term, Roosevelt focused on the poor strata, being labeled a traitor by those of his own background. His victory in New York put him on the doorstep of a presidential candidacy. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He won with 472 electoral votes against 59. In 1928, Republican Herbert Hoover had won the presidency and appeared as a potentially stronger candidate when seeking re-election in 1932. But the Great Depression changed history in 1929, and the 1932 elections took place at the height of the economic crisis, with FDR as the Democratic candidate appealing to the New Deal. Although many voters did not fully understand what this New Deal was, Roosevelt obtained a clear victory in the popular vote that became overwhelming in the Electoral College, 472 out of 531. In his inaugural address on March 4, 1933, FDR uttered a phrase that has become legendary. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." The New Deal, the most radical expansion of government in U.S. history. The New Deal was a new economic policy centered on massive public spending. During his first years in office, FDR carried out an ambitious plan of infrastructure investments that helped reduce sharp unemployment and stimulate consumption. The New Deal put money in the hands of millions of people who had previously been unemployed and survived on one meal a day in charity soup kitchens, supported among others by Al Capone. Hydroelectric plants, schools, roads, and other public works gave a qualitative and quantitative leap to U.S. infrastructure, laying the foundation for subsequent economic recovery. The New Deal did not resolve the economic crisis on its own, but it modernized the country and had an undeniable social success. Executive Order 6102. The government confiscated all citizens' gold and then revalued it in its favor. On April 5, 1933, President FDR signed Executive Order 6102, which required that gold held by individuals, including coins, jewelry, bullion, and other forms of the precious metal, be sold to the U.S. Treasury at $20.67 per ounce. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 increased the price to $35 per ounce, allowing the Federal Reserve to print more bills to increase liquidity. That was its true purpose. The measure was questioned for its inflationary impact and for preventing the public from protecting savings through gold holdings, a store of value since ancient times. Fireside chats. The president who entered the living rooms of 60 million homes via radio. Although Roosevelt's press conferences were freewheeling and crowded, sometimes with up to 1,000 people present, his great communication tool was radio, an event that revolutionized politics before television. Roosevelt used radio like no politician before him, and his fireside chats reached 60 million American homes for nearly a decade between 1933 and 1944. The radio broadcasts had two advantages. They avoided often uncontrollable press conferences with reviews that did not always reflect what he wanted, and they allowed him to reach Americans directly with his convincing words. He tried to add 6 extra justices to the Supreme Court to control it, his worst political mistake. In 1936, with his popularity rising thanks to the New Deal, FDR was re-elected with a landslide of 523 electoral votes to just 8 for his Republican rival, Alf Landon. In February 1937, Roosevelt surprised Americans by proposing a plan to expand the Supreme Court and shift the balance of power in his favor. The court had ruled against some New Deal measures, and the president sought authority to appoint an additional justice for each one over 70 years old on the court. With opponents to the plan in the court and even within the Democratic Party, Roosevelt failed in his project. He broke Washington's sacred tradition, the first president to win a third term. The 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which limits presidents to no more than 2 terms, was established in 1951, but before that there was a kind of sacred tradition to observe this limit. FDR broke with custom and ran again in 1940, with World War II already underway. This time he won again, broadly but with a slightly less overwhelming margin than in 1936. 449 electoral votes to 84 for his Republican opponent Wendell Willkie. Roosevelt was the first president with 3 terms, though he did not stop there. He won a 4th term in 1944, which was cut short by his death in 1945. The secret pact with the press. Only 2 or 3 photos exist of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. Roosevelt was in a wheelchair for nearly 2.5 decades, including his time as governor of New York and his 13 years as president. However, he was always photographed from the waist up, as if sitting in an ordinary chair behind a desk. FDR did not want his fellow citizens or the foreign public to see the President of the United States in a wheelchair, and there are only 2 or 3 photos showing him seated in one. When he met with King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia aboard the USS Quincy in the Suez Canal on February 14, 1945, FDR gave one of his wheelchairs to the ailing king. "Your boys will not be sent to foreign wars," the promise he would break 13 months later. In 1940, the United Kingdom was nearly bankrupt from its war effort against Germany. And in November, Lord Lothian, the British ambassador to the United States, arrived at LaGuardia Airport and told reporters, "Great Britain is broke. We need your money." The ambassador was criticized even by Churchill for his lack of diplomatic tact, but he bluntly stated a reality. For his part, Roosevelt faced isolationists in Congress and, despite aid already provided, could not appear too generous. So FDR invented the Lend-Lease Act to continue financing Great Britain. To the American people, he said on October 15, 1940, in Boston, "I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." After Pearl Harbor, he had to break his promise. The arsenal of democracy. While promising peace, he secretly prepared for war. With an election campaign underway in 1940, FDR's main concern was how to keep the United States out of the war as a belligerent while not appearing unsupportive of Europe. On November 2nd, he said in Rochester, "Your national government is equally a government of peace, a government that intends to keep the peace for the American people." On November 3rd, he declared in Cleveland, "The first purpose of our foreign policy is to keep our country out of the war." However, since 1940, the U.S. government had been taking steps to sideline the Neutrality Act, and in January 1941, a secret joint U.S.-British staff began meeting, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement was a September 1940 deal in which the United States transferred destroyers to the United Kingdom in exchange for British military bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. This strategy violated specific U.S. laws, including those on neutrality. In fact, a government conference of jurists at the time stated that the Destroyers for Bases Agreement had legally and morally put the United States into the war. This pact, combined with Lend-Lease and secret high command meetings between the U.S. and Great Britain, set the stage for escalation leading to the American entry into the war, precipitated by Pearl Harbor. The Lend-Lease Act turned the United States into the great logistical supplier of the Allies. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act gave FDR broad power to spend funds allocated by Congress as he saw fit. Immediately, the newly created Office of Lend-Lease Administration sent food and war materials to British ports while the government managed the expansion of countries that could benefit from the new legislation. By late 1942, the list of beneficiaries included the Soviet Union, China, Australia, New Zealand, and the exiled governments of the Netherlands, Poland, and Norway. Later, Free France under Charles de Gaulle received supplies, as did several new Latin American allies, including Brazil, Peru, and Paraguay. In September 1941, Roosevelt ordered U.S. ships to shoot at German submarines in the Atlantic. In April 1941, the United States intensified naval patrols in the Atlantic to observe German submarine movements and report to the British Navy. In September of that year, the U.S. Navy received orders to fire on German submarines that approached dangerously, and it has been noted that hostilities between the United States and the Axis powers actually began at that moment, not in December after the official declaration of war following Pearl Harbor. In November 1941, the United States authorized the arming of merchant ships sailing in war zones. Several of these ships carried weapons to the Allies. The freezing of Japanese assets and the whole note of November 26, 1941. Japan's expansionism in Asia and the Pacific was met with escalating U.S. sanctions that in November 1941 resulted in the freezing of Japanese assets in the United States. This measure was echoed by the United Kingdom and the Dutch East Indies, effectively becoming a trade blockade of the Japanese Empire. Tensions rose even further before Pearl Harbor due to Secretary of State Cordell Hull's note giving Japan an ultimatum to withdraw from China and other occupied countries. A date that will live in infamy. Pearl Harbor and the speech that changed history. December 7, 1941, marked a turning point when 353 Japanese aircraft attacked the U.S. Naval Air Base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing 2,403 Americans, destroying 188 aircraft on the ground, and damaging numerous warships. Americans were stunned, and FDR delivered his famous speech to Congress. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb so secret that not even his vice president knew it existed. The Manhattan Project, carried out between 1942 and 1947 to provide the United States with the atomic bomb, was the most complex in U.S. history up to that point. More than 130,000 people worked on it in 1945, a huge challenge to keep secret despite compartmentalization. No one unrelated was informed, including Vice Presidents Henry Wallace and Harry Truman, who learned of a nuclear bomb's existence one day after succeeding Roosevelt in the presidency. The Big Three, the conferences with the allies that divided the world. The three highest-level political summits during the war among the allies were Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta. Casablanca in Morocco took place in January 1943 and was attended by FDR, Churchill, and French leaders Charles de Gaulle and Henri Giroux. Stalin declined due to the Battle of Stalingrad. Tehran, with Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, was held in late fall 1943, where the Normandy invasion was decided. Yalta and Crimea reunited the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the USSR in February 1945, with Germany nearly defeated. Its main purpose was to establish post-war borders. D-Day, the prayer that 100 million Americans heard while their sons landed in Normandy. Around 160,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel from Britain on June 6, 1944, during the Normandy invasion. On D-Day night, FDR addressed Americans by radio in the tone of a prayer. My fellow Americans, last night, when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another major operation. So far, it has been a success. Fourth term, they chose Truman as vice president in a shady backroom deal that would change history. FDR ran for his fourth term in 1944, but incumbent Vice President Henry Wallace lacked the necessary support to be renominated and was replaced by Harry Truman thanks to a controversial shift by Southern delegates at the Democratic Convention. This decision changed history, as after Roosevelt's death, Vice President Truman assumed the presidency and had to make the dramatic decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Did Roosevelt know Japan would attack Pearl Harbor and allow it? The conspiracy theory that never dies. 8.5 decades after Pearl Harbor, a conspiracy theory that never ceases among Americans is that FDR knew of the attack plan and let it happen to justify U.S. entry into the war. Supporters of this hypothesis argue that Roosevelt had been taking steps to enter the war long before Pearl Harbor. Most historians hold that the U.S. government believed a Japanese attack was possible due to high tensions but did not know where it would occur. Naive with Stalin or coldly realistic? The debate historians cannot resolve. Given what happened after the war with Eastern European countries that fell under Soviet orbit, Roosevelt and Churchill were harshly criticized for their alleged naivety towards Stalin. Were they naive in believing Stalin's promises of free elections in Eastern Europe, when he had never held them in the USSR? Or were they coldly realistic and understood that the war would prolong if they did not cede to Stalin the territories already occupied? A debate that never ends. A dying president no one could know was dying. FDR had been dying since 1944, but with the war still ongoing, that news was forbidden. He made a supreme effort to attend the Yalta Conference from February 4th to 11th, 1945. In the famous photo from that meeting, which decided the new world borders after the war, he appears quite deteriorated, seated in the center of the Big Three, with Churchill to his right and Stalin to his left. The medical cover-up, how his doctors lied to an entire nation about his true health condition. In March 1944, Roosevelt, a heavy smoker, was examined at Bethesda Hospital and diagnosed with hypertension, congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, angina pectoris, and atherosclerosis. On October 12th of that year, during the election campaign, his personal physician, Admiral Ross McIntyre, declared, "The president's health is perfectly fine. There is no organic difficulty whatsoever." Last days in Warm Springs. He could no longer even swim in the pool that had helped him. After contracting polio, Roosevelt returned from Yalta visibly deteriorated. In his speech to Congress, he spoke seated, an unprecedented concession to his physical incapacity. He spent his final days at the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, a place he had founded as a hydrotherapy and polio rehabilitation institute. He could no longer swim, an activity that had been his refuge while recovering from the illness. The secret at his deathbed: his lover Lucy Mercer was with him, Eleanor was not. Lucy Mercer, the woman who had caused the breakup, though not the divorce, between Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor, married a wealthy widower in 1920, but he died in 1944. FDR and Lucy began seeing each other again because the president needed affectionate companionship. When Roosevelt died, Lucy was by his side, which greatly upset Eleanor, who was not present. "I have a terrific headache." His last words before dying at 3:35 p.m. On April 12, 1945, FDR was posing for painter Elizabeth Shumatoff, who was making his portrait. Suddenly he said, "I have a terrific headache," and slumped forward. He was carried to his bedroom in the Little White House, but never regained consciousness. He was declared dead at 3:35 p.m. from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. At age 63, less than a month later, the war in Europe ended. A nation mourns the most powerful president of the century and discovers he governed from a wheelchair. Roosevelt's body was transported by train to Washington, D.C., with the country at war. It was decided not to hold a state funeral, but a less pompous ceremony. The body lay in state at the White House, not the Capitol. Millions of Americans mourned FDR, and many learned only after his death that he had governed from a wheelchair. We hope this video has been helpful to you. If you have something to add, please share it with us in the comment section. Give this video a like and send the link to your family and best friends so they can also learn more about the chilling death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you're new to our channel, don't forget to subscribe. Follow us on all our social networks. They'll be down here in the description. Remember, a people who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it.